Ranger. Tom Mitchell had walked these mountain trails for 15 years, but he'd never seen this cabin before. Hidden beneath decades of moss and twisted vines, the structure appeared forgotten by time itself. The wooden walls sagged under nature's patient assault, and fog clung to its rotting eaves like ghostly fingers. Yet something was wrong. The brass door handle gleamed as if recently polished. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of amber light, revealing a scene that defied explanation. The stone fireplace crackled with fresh flames. Steam rose from a coffee cup sitting beside an open leather journal. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, and as Tom leaned closer to read, his blood turned to ice. The entries described his morning routine in perfect detail. His drive to the trailhead, his decision to explore the unmarked path, his discovery of this very cabin. But how could someone have written about events that had just happened? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tom's hands trembled as he flipped through the journal pages. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, as if someone had taken great care to record every detail. The entries began 3 days ago, but they weren't written like memories. They read like predictions. Day 1, the ranger will wake at 5:47 a.m. He will drink his coffee black, stronger than usual because he didn't sleep well. The nightmare about Sarah will have returned. He will check his phone twice for messages that won't come. Tom's breath caught. Sarah, his ex-wife's name, appeared in a stranger's journal, written by someone who couldn't possibly know about the divorce, about the sleepless nights, about the recurring dream where she walked away from him in slow motion while he stood paralyzed, unable to call her name. He will drive the old logging road past Miller's Creek, taking the turn toward Widow's Peak instead of his usual patrol route. Something will draw him deeper into the forest than he's been in months. The coffee cup beside the journal still steamed. Tom reached out tentatively, his fingers hovering inches from the ceramic handle. The warmth radiating from it felt real enough, but everything about this situation defied logic. He'd been a forest ranger for 15 years, had seen plenty of abandoned cabins, squatter camps, and illegal campsites. But nothing like this. The cabin itself seemed caught between decay and preservation. The roof sagged under the weight of fallen branches and accumulated moss, yet no water dripped through. The windows were clouded with age and dirt, but they remained intact. Most unsettling of all, the air inside felt warm and lived in, despite the obvious signs that no one had maintained this place in decades. Tom pulled out his radio, checking for signal strength. Static crackled back at him. The mountains often interfered with communications, but he'd never experienced complete radio silence in this area before. His cell phone showed no bars either, which wasn't unusual at this elevation. But it added to his growing unease. He turned back to the journal, forcing himself to read the next entry despite every instinct telling him to leave immediately. Day 2. He will find the second marker exactly 2.3 miles northwest of the cabin. The carved symbol will match the one above the fireplace. He will spend an hour trying to convince himself it's coincidence. Tom's eyes snapped to the stone mantel above the crackling fire. There, barely visible beneath decades of soot and grime, someone had carved a symbol into the rock. It looked like a spiral intersecting with 3 straight lines, creating a pattern that seemed familiar yet alien. The craftsmanship was precise, as if carved by someone with both skill and infinite patience. He will return to the cabin that evening, telling himself he's investigating potential illegal activity. He will bring his emergency supplies and plan to camp nearby. He won't admit even to himself that he's curious about what the journal says will happen next. Tom read the words twice, then closed the journal abruptly. This was elaborate nonsense, had to be. Someone was playing an incredibly sophisticated prank, though he couldn't imagine who or why. Perhaps environmental activists trying to discourage logging in the area, or local teenagers with too much time and creativity. But the details were too specific, too personal. The mention of Sarah, of his nightmare, of his exact morning routine. Tom prided himself on being a creature of habit, but he'd never realized how predictable his patterns had become until seeing them documented in a stranger's careful handwriting. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and Tom noticed something else unusual. The wood burning in the fireplace looked fresh, recently cut. The bark still held moisture, and the flames burned with the clean smell of living timber rather than the dusty odor of aged wood. Someone had been here recently, within the last few hours at most. Tom checked his watch, 3:17 p.m. He'd been in the cabin for nearly 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade earlier than usual, filtered through the heavy canopy and persistent fog that seemed to cling to this particular valley. He photographed the journal's open pages with his phone. Though without signal, he couldn't send them to anyone. The camera captured the elegant handwriting clearly, providing evidence that this wasn't some stress-induced hallucination. Whatever was happening here was real, documented, and apparently ongoing. The smart thing would be to leave immediately, return to his truck, and radio for backup once he reached an area with better reception. But the journal's prediction nagged at him. Would he really return this evening? Would he camp nearby, driven by curiosity? He wouldn't admit to himself. Tom looked around the cabin one more time, noting details he'd missed in his initial shock. A second coffee cup sat in the small kitchen area, as if waiting for a guest. Fresh provisions lined the shelves. Canned goods with recent expiration dates, bottled water, matches in a waterproof container. Someone had prepared this place for extended occupancy. Tom stepped outside the cabin, needing fresh air and distance from the impossible journal. The fog had thickened during his time inside, reducing visibility to mere yards. Trees emerged from the mist like silent sentinels, their branches reaching toward him with an almost deliberate menace. He pulled out his GPS unit, hoping to mark the cabin's location for his report. The device flickered, showing his position as a blank void on the topographical map. According to the GPS, he was standing in an area that didn't exist. Coordinates that fell between mapped sections of the forest. That was when he heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through fallen leaves somewhere in the fog ahead. Tom froze, listening intently. In 15 years of forest service, he'd developed an ear for different types of movement. This wasn't the random pattern of wildlife or the hurried gait of lost hikers. These footsteps had purpose, direction, and an unsettling rhythm that seemed to match his own heartbeat. "Hello," Tom called out, his voice muffled by the dense air. "Forest Service. Is someone out there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. Tom waited, counting seconds in his head, 20, 30, 45. Just as he began to wonder if he'd imagined the sound, the footsteps resumed, closer now, circling around to his left. Whoever was out there was moving with the confidence of someone who knew these woods intimately. "I'm Ranger Mitchell," Tom announced, louder this time. "I need to speak with you about this cabin." A voice drifted through the fog, so soft Tom almost missed it. "You're early." The words sent ice through his veins. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It carried the hollow quality of sound, traveling through empty spaces, as if spoken from the bottom of a well. "Early for what?" Tom demanded, his hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to his belt. "Still nothing but static. You weren't supposed to find the cabin until tomorrow," the voice continued, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "The journal entries are very specific about timing." Tom's throat went dry. "Who are you?" "Show yourself." A shape moved in the fog, barely visible, always just at the edge of his vision. When he turned to look directly, it vanished, only to reappear in his peripheral vision moments later. "I'm the one who's been waiting," the voice said. "The one who wrote what you've already read. That's impossible. The journal describes things that happened this morning. No one could have known, couldn't they?" The question hung in the air like the fog itself, thick and obscuring. Tom realized he was breathing heavily, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't just elaborate trickery anymore. This was something fundamentally wrong with reality itself. The second marker, the voice continued conversationally. You'll find it exactly where the journal says. 2.3 miles northwest. The symbol will be carved into a granite boulder, waist-high, partially hidden by ferns. Tom backed toward the cabin, needing something solid against his spine. How do you know what I haven't done yet? Because I've seen this conversation before. Many times. You always ask the same questions in the same order. There was something almost sad in the voice now, a weariness that spoke of endless repetition. You'll leave now, telling yourself this is an elaborate hoax. You'll spend the afternoon trying to rationalize what you've experienced. By evening, curiosity will overcome caution, and you'll return. No, Tom said firmly. I'm leaving, and I'm not coming back. I'm going to report this location and let someone else investigate. You can't report what doesn't exist on any map, the voice replied. And the others won't be able to find this place. The cabin only appears for you, Tom. Only when you're ready to understand. Understand what? Why you've been having the nightmare about Sarah. Why you chose the unmarked path instead of your usual route. Why you felt so lost since she left. The voice drew closer, though Tom still couldn't see its source. This place calls to people who are searching for something they can't name. Tom's legs felt weak. The mention of Sarah again. The intimate knowledge of his private struggles. The way this stranger seemed to peer directly into his soul. None of it made sense, yet he couldn't deny the profound accuracy of every statement. You're not real, he whispered. Neither is the pain you carry every day. Neither are the regrets that keep you awake at night. Neither is the feeling that you're living someone else's life. The voice paused. But they're all true anyway, aren't they? Tom stumbled backward, his boots catching on the cabin's front step. He spun around, grabbing the door handle, desperate to put solid walls between himself and whatever was speaking to him from the fog. But the cabin door wouldn't open. The handle turned freely, but the door remained sealed, as if the building itself had decided he wasn't ready to leave. Tom threw his shoulder against the cabin door, panic rising in his chest. The wood groaned but held firm. He tried the handle again, pushing and pulling with increasing desperation. Behind him, the voice in the fog continued speaking with maddening calm. Fighting won't help. Tom, the cabin will let you leave when you're ready to understand what you've found here. This is insane, Tom muttered, circling the cabin's perimeter. Every window was latched from the inside, though he distinctly remembered not securing them. The back door, barely visible through overgrown vegetation, proved equally immovable. He pulled out his cell phone and began taking photographs of everything. The sealed doors, the impossible fresh smoke rising from the chimney, the carved symbol above the entrance. Without signal, he couldn't transmit the images, but they would serve as evidence that this experience was real, not some stress-induced breakdown. The voice seemed to read his thoughts. Evidence won't matter if no one believes you. And they won't, you know. A seasoned ranger claiming he found a cabin that doesn't exist on any survey, talking to invisible people in the fog. They'll recommend counseling and desk duty. Tom stopped photographing and stared into the mist. What do you want from me? I want you to read the journal completely, to understand what's been written about the next 3 days, to see how this story ends, and if I refuse, then you'll repeat this conversation until you choose differently. Time works strangely here, Tom. Some moments last forever. Others never happened at all. The fog began to thin slightly, and Tom caught glimpses of movement that made no sense. Trees seemed to shift position when he wasn't looking directly at them. Paths appeared and disappeared like mirages. Most disturbing of all, he occasionally saw his own footprints in the muddy ground, leading both toward and away from the cabin in patterns that suggested he'd been walking in circles for hours. He checked his watch, 3:17 p.m. The same time he'd noted inside the cabin. The hands hadn't moved, despite what felt like 30 minutes of conversation and exploration. Either his watch had stopped, or time itself was malfunctioning in this place. A new sound emerged from the forest, the distant rumble of his own truck engine. Tom's blood chilled as he recognized the specific diesel knock that meant his engine needed maintenance. But his truck was parked over a mile away at the trailhead, locked and secured. "You're hearing yourself arrive," the voice explained. "Again. That's impossible. You've said that 14 times now, across different versions of this afternoon. Each time you resist a little longer. Each time you ask slightly different questions. But you always end up reading the complete journal." Tom felt reality tilting around him like a ship in rough seas. Different versions? Time isn't linear here. Past, present, and future exist simultaneously. The journal doesn't predict what will happen. It records what has already occurred, is occurring, and will occur again. The truck engine grew louder, and through the fog, Tom saw the impossible, his own green Forest Service vehicle emerging from a path that hadn't existed moments before. Behind the wheel sat another version of himself, looking exactly as Tom had when he'd arrived hours earlier. The other Tom parked, checked his radio, and began walking toward the cabin with the same cautious curiosity Tom remembered feeling. "Watch," the voice instructed. Tom observed his duplicate discover the cabin, approach the door, and enter with the same mixture of professional duty and personal intrigue. Everything played out exactly as Tom remembered experiencing it, down to the way his other self paused at the threshold before stepping inside. "How many times?" Tom whispered. "This is iteration 17. You're learning faster this time, asking better questions. Progress of a sort. What happens if I just walk away? Leave the forest entirely? You've tried that. In iteration 12, you made it all the way to your truck. But the road led back here. All roads lead back here now, Tom, until you finish what you started." The cabin door creaked open, though Tom was certain it had been firmly sealed moments before. Warm light spilled out, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something else, something that reminded him of Sarah's perfume, faint but unmistakable. "She's why you're here," the voice said gently. "Not the cabin, not the journal, her." Tom's chest tightened. "Sarah's been gone for 8 months. She moved to Portland, started a new life. This has nothing to do with her, doesn't it? When did you last sleep well? When did you last feel like yourself? When did you stop believing you deserved happiness?" The questions hit like physical blows. Tom had been asking himself the same things for months, unable to find answers that brought any peace. "The journal will show you what you've been running from," the voice continued. "What you've been too afraid to face since she left. Why you chose the path that led here instead of your safe, predictable patrol route." Tom looked at the open cabin door, then at his duplicate still moving through the same discovery sequence in the fog. Time folded around him like origami, past and present occupying the same space. "Reading that journal won't bring her back," he said. "No, but it might bring you back to yourself." Tom walked back into the cabin, each step feeling like a surrender to forces beyond his comprehension. The journal lay open exactly where he'd left it, though the pages now showed different text. The handwriting remained the same elegant script, but the content had changed, becoming more personal, more invasive. He will resist reading about Sarah for exactly 43 minutes. He will tell himself that some memories are too painful to revisit, that some wounds need to stay buried. But curiosity always wins. It's his greatest strength and his deepest weakness. Tom's hands shook as he turned the page. The fire crackled behind him, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. Sarah left on a Tuesday morning in February. She packed while he was at work, taking only her clothes and the photo of them from their honeymoon in Colorado. She left her engagement ring on the kitchen table with a note. "I can't compete with a ghost anymore." He never understood what she meant. The words hit Tom like a physical assault. He'd never told anyone about the note, had barely admitted to himself that he'd memorized every word. Sarah's handwriting appeared on the page exactly as he remembered it, down to the way she dotted her I's with small circles instead of points. But she was wrong about the ghost. It wasn't someone from his past haunting their relationship. It was someone from his future, the man he might have become if he'd been brave enough to change. Tom slammed the journal shut, but it immediately fell open again to a new page. The writing continued, as if his resistance was irrelevant. He will remember the fight now, the one they never finished. 3 days before she left, when she asked why he'd become a forest ranger instead of pursuing the graduate degree in environmental science he'd always talked about. Why he chose the safe job, the predictable life, the careful boundaries that kept him from risking real failure or real success. The memory surfaced unbidden, sharp and painful. Sarah in their kitchen, still wearing her scrubs from the hospital where she worked as a nurse, exhaustion making her blunt in a way that cut straight to the truth. You're hiding, Tom, from your own life. You've made yourself so small and safe that there's no room for dreams anymore. He'd been angry then, defensive, had accused her of not appreciating his steady job, his reliability. But even as he'd spoken the words, he'd known she was right. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped growing, stopped reaching, stopped believing he deserved more than just getting by. She loved him enough to want him to become himself. He loved her enough to let her go rather than drag her down into his carefully constructed smallness. Tom looked around the cabin, seeing it with new eyes. The preserved interior, the careful maintenance, the sense of time standing still. It was a perfect metaphor for the life he'd built. Beautiful in its way, but trapped, unchanging, slowly decaying despite all efforts to keep it frozen in place. The voice from the fog drifted through the walls as if they were made of mist. You're beginning to understand. Understand what? That I'm a coward. That I let fear make all my decisions. I already knew that. Understanding and accepting are different things. You've spent 8 months punishing yourself for losing Sarah, but you lost yourself long before she left. Tom opened the journal again, no longer trying to resist. The pages showed a detailed account of his life over the past year. The sleepless nights, the mechanical routine of work, the way he'd stopped seeing beauty in the forests he patrolled. Day after day of going through motions, maintaining the appearance of a life while feeling increasingly hollow inside. He tells people he loves his job, loves the solitude, loves the connection to nature. All true statements that add up to one large lie. He doesn't love anything anymore. Love requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires the possibility of loss. The cabin grew warmer, or perhaps Tom was feverish. The air shimmered with heat waves that reminded him of summer afternoons when reality became fluid and anything seemed possible. Why show me this? He asked aloud. What's the point of forcing me to relive my failures? Because you can't heal what you won't acknowledge. Because the story doesn't end with Sarah leaving. Because you have a choice to make and you need to understand what you're choosing between. Tom turned to the final entries in the journal, pages that had been blank when he'd first opened the book. Now they contained detailed descriptions of the next 2 days, written in that same impossible predictive past tense. Tomorrow, he will find the second marker. The carved symbol will unlock memories he's buried so deep he's forgotten they exist. He will remember why he wanted to be a scientist, why he dreamed of understanding the hidden connections that bind forest ecosystems together. He will remember the man Sarah fell in love with. The words blurred as Tom's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back for months. Below the entry, in different handwriting, Sarah's handwriting, someone had added a single line. He was never a ghost to me. He was a lighthouse that forgot how to shine. Tom stared at Sarah's handwriting until the words burned themselves into his memory. But as he watched, the ink began to fade, disappearing letter by letter until only his own entries remained visible. The journal was rewriting itself in real time, erasing evidence of impossibilities even as they occurred. That wasn't real, he whispered. But his voice carried no conviction. Real is a flexible concept here, the disembodied voice replied. What matters is truth, and the truth is that Sarah never stopped believing in you. Even when she left, Tom closed the journal and stood abruptly, pacing the small confines of the cabin. The walls seemed to pulse around him like a living thing, breathing in rhythm with his own ragged breaths. He needed air, needed space, needed anything but the suffocating weight of revelations he wasn't ready to process. But when he reached for the door handle, his reflection in the window stopped him cold. It wasn't his face looking back at him. The man in the glass was younger, cleaner shaven, wearing the khaki field clothes of a graduate student rather than a ranger's uniform. His eyes held the bright intensity Tom remembered from his early 20s, before disappointment and compromise had dulled them to their current weary grey. "Who are you?" Tom demanded of his reflection. The other Tom smiled sadly and pressed his palm against the glass from the inside. "I'm who you were before you learned to be afraid. Before you decided that wanting things too much was dangerous." Tom stumbled backward, but everywhere he looked, reflective surfaces showed him different versions of himself. The coffee pot revealed Tom at 30, confident and passionate about his research proposals. The glass door of the wood stove showed him at 25, defending his master's thesis with conviction that radiated from every gesture. A small mirror above the wash basin reflected Tom at 45, greying but vital, leading a team of researchers through an old-growth forest. "These aren't memories," Tom said. "These are fantasies. Things that never happened. They're possibilities," his reflection corrected. "Futures you could have chosen. Lives you could have lived if you hadn't been so terrified of failing that you stopped trying to succeed." The cabin began to shift around him. Walls expanded and contracted like lungs. The floor tilted at impossible angles, then righted itself. Books appeared on previously empty shelves, their titles revealing the research he'd never pursued. Mycorrhizal networks in Pacific Northwest forests, climate adaptation strategies for temperate ecosystems. The hidden language of trees. Tom grabbed one of the books and opened it to find pages filled with his own handwriting, not the careful script from the journal, but the hasty notes of scientific observation. Sketches of root systems and fungal networks covered the margins. Data tables tracked seasonal changes in soil composition. This was the work of the man he'd dreamed of becoming. "When did you write this?" he asked his reflection. "I didn't, you did. In the timeline where you followed your passion instead of your fear, where you applied for the doctoral program at Oregon State instead of settling for the ranger position, where you became Dr. Thomas Mitchell, forest ecologist instead of Ranger Mitchell, keeping other people's discoveries safe." Tom flipped through page after page of research he'd never conducted, findings he'd never made, insights that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. The work was brilliant, groundbreaking, exactly the kind of contribution he'd once dreamed of making to scientific understanding. Sarah stayed in that timeline, another reflection said, this one speaking from the bathroom mirror. She stayed because you were growing instead of shrinking, because you were becoming more yourself instead of less. But I chose the safe path, Tom protested. I chose financial security, stable employment, a predictable life. That was the responsible thing to do. Responsible to whom? The reflection asked. To parents who never asked you to sacrifice your dreams? To a society that benefits from passionate researchers? To Sarah, who fell in love with your curiosity and vision? The cabin shuddered, and suddenly Tom was looking through the windows at scenes that shouldn't exist. Outside, he saw himself at different ages, living different lives. Tom the professor, explaining complex ecological relationships to fascinated students. Tom the researcher, publishing papers that changed environmental policy. Tom the husband, growing old with Sarah in a house filled with books and laughter and the kind of deep contentment that comes from pursuing meaningful work. All of these are real, his reflection explained. They exist in parallel timelines, alternate possibilities that branch from every choice you make. The cabin exists at the intersection of all these realities. It's where lost souls come to see what they might have been, Tom sank into the chair beside the fireplace, overwhelmed by the weight of infinite possibility. Why show me this? What's the point of torturing me with lives I can never live? Because you can, his reflection said simply. Time isn't fixed here. Choice isn't final. The man who entered this cabin can leave as someone else entirely. The journal fell open in his lap to pages he'd never seen before, filled with entries describing not what had happened, but what could happen. Tomorrow's possibilities written in a future tense that felt more like prophecy than prediction. Tom read the future entries with growing urgency, each word reshaping his understanding of what was possible. The journal described not just one tomorrow, but dozens of them, each branching from decisions he had yet to make. In Timeline A, he will leave the cabin at dawn, drive straight to the district office, and submit his resignation. He will apply to graduate school that afternoon. Sarah will answer when he calls to tell her about his decision. In Timeline B, he will burn the journal, deny what he's experienced, and return to his patrol duties. He will die alone 17 years from now, still wondering what his life might have been. In Timeline C, he will take the journal with him, but change nothing. He will carry the weight of infinite possibility like a stone in his chest until it stops his heart at age 63. The fire behind him roared higher, flames reaching toward the chimney with unnatural intensity. Tom could feel the heat on his back. But it wasn't warmth, it was urgency, pressure, the universe itself demanding that he choose. How much time do I have? He asked the empty room. His reflection in the window mouthed words Tom couldn't hear, but the journal answered for him. The window between timelines closes at sunrise. After that, quantum possibilities collapse into singular reality. The cabin will fade back into the forest, and the choice will be made by default. Tom checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. He'd been in the cabin for over 8 hours, though it felt like minutes and eternities simultaneously. Outside, the fog had thickened to an impenetrable wall of white that seemed to glow with its own internal light. He walked to the wash basin and splashed cold water on his face, studying his reflection in the mirror above. The man looking back at him seemed to flicker between different ages, different possibilities. Sometimes he saw the worn-down ranger he'd become. Sometimes he glimpsed the passionate scientist he'd abandoned. Occasionally, for just a moment, he caught sight of versions of himself he'd never imagined. Older, weathered by different kinds of experience, marked by choices both brave and terrible. What if I choose wrong? He asked his reflection. There is no wrong, his other self replied. There's only chosen and unchosen. The tragedy isn't making the wrong decision. It's making no decision at all. Tom returned to the journal, reading deeper into the future possibilities. Some timelines showed him famous, his research revolutionizing forest management. Others showed him struggling, pursuing his passion through years of financial hardship and professional setbacks. But in every timeline where he chose growth over safety, his eyes held a light that had been absent for years. The most important choice isn't about career or location or even love, read one entry. It's about whether he will start believing in himself again, whether he will choose to become someone worthy of his own dreams. The cabin began to change around him as midnight approached. The walls became transparent, showing glimpses of all the possible futures, spreading out like branches of an infinite tree. Tom saw himself teaching, researching, discovering, failing, succeeding, living. In some timelines, Sarah was there. In others, he found different love or chose meaningful solitude. But in every timeline where he acted from courage rather than fear, he looked like a man who belonged in his own life. A new sound emerged from the forest, footsteps approaching the cabin. But these weren't the mysterious steps Tom had heard earlier. These were familiar, purposeful, belonging to someone who knew exactly where she was going. Sarah emerged from the fog, looking exactly as she had the morning she left 8 months ago. Her auburn hair caught the light from the cabin windows, and her green eyes held the mixture of love and sadness Tom remembered from their last conversation. "You're not real," Tom said. though he made no move to step away from the window. "I'm as real as you need me to be," Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly through the glass. "Real enough to tell you what I couldn't say when I left, which was that I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because you stopped loving yourself, and I couldn't watch you disappear inch by inch." She pressed her palm against the window, and Tom found himself matching the gesture from inside. "I left because staying meant enabling your fear, and I loved you too much to do that. I was trying to be responsible, stable, the kind of man who could take care of you. I never needed you to take care of me. Tom, I needed you to take care of your dreams, to be the man I fell in love with, the one who wanted to understand the secret language of forests, who believed his work could change the world." Tom's throat tightened. What if I try and fail? What if I'm not smart enough, not dedicated enough, not worthy of those dreams? Then you'll fail as yourself instead of succeeding as someone else. And failure while pursuing something meaningful is still more alive than success while hiding from everything that matters. The journal in Tom's hands grew warm, its pages glowing with soft light. The final entry appeared as he watched, written in his own handwriting, but in a style that seemed to come from a deeper, truer version of himself. "Tomorrow, I choose to become who I was meant to be. Not because success is guaranteed, but because the alternative, remaining who I've settled for being, is no longer acceptable. Some cages are so comfortable we forget they're prisons. Some safety is so complete it becomes its own kind of death." Tom stood at the threshold between timelines, the journal burning bright in his hands like a torch against the darkness of indecision. Outside the window, Sarah waited with infinite patience, her presence both anchor and compass, pointing toward the man he'd forgotten he could become. "How do I choose?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't choose a timeline," Sarah replied. "You choose who you want to be in this moment. The timeline shapes itself around that choice. The cabin filled with swirling energy, past and future, colliding in a maelstrom of possibility. Tom saw fragments of every life he might live flash before his eyes like a film reel spinning out of control. The overwhelming cascade of potential paralyzed him, each option seeming both perfect and terrifying. Then, in the chaos of infinite possibility, he remembered something simple. The first day he'd walked into an old-growth forest as a college student. The sense of wonder that had filled him when he realized trees communicated through underground networks, sharing nutrients and information across vast distances. The moment he'd understood that he was looking at intelligence so ancient and complex that human science had barely begun to comprehend it. That wonder was still there, buried under years of compromise and fear. Tom could feel it stirring, an ember that had never quite died. "I remember why I wanted to understand the forest," he said, speaking to Sarah but really talking to himself. Not to control it or manage it, but to listen to it, to learn its language. The journal in his hands began to dissolve, its words transferring directly into his memory before the pages crumbled to ash and blew away on a wind that existed only inside the cabin. As the last fragments disappeared, Tom felt a profound shift, as if some fundamental weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The journal was never about predicting the future, he realized. It was about showing me that I still had one. Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her face with joy Tom hadn't seen since their early days together. "Now you understand, but what about us? Even if I change, even if I become the man I was meant to be, you're still gone. You still left. I left a man who had given up on himself. But the man standing here now." She studied his face, seeing something there that made her eyes brighten. "This man, I never stopped loving." The cabin around them began to fade, its walls becoming translucent, then transparent, then disappearing entirely. But instead of leaving them exposed to the fog-shrouded forest, the dissolution revealed something incredible, a vast network of light connecting every tree, every plant, every living thing in an intricate web of communication and mutual support. Tom gasped as he saw the forest's true nature for the first time. Bioluminescent threads pulsed between root systems, carrying chemical signals and shared resources. Ancient trees glowed with accumulated wisdom, their light connecting to younger saplings in chains of teaching and learning that stretched back centuries. The entire ecosystem breathed with unified purpose, each organism contributing to a collective intelligence that dwarfed any human understanding. "This is what you're meant to study," Sarah said, her voice filled with awe. "This is what you're meant to help the world understand." Tom reached out tentatively, his fingers touching one of the glowing threads connecting a massive Douglas fir to its neighbors. Information flowed through the connection, not words or images, but pure knowledge about soil conditions, weather patterns, the health and needs of the entire forest community. For a moment, Tom became part of the network, understanding at a cellular level how life sustained itself through cooperation and communication. "I can see it," he whispered. "I can actually see how they talk to each other, because you're finally listening with your whole self instead of just your trained mind," Sarah replied. "This is what happens when you stop trying to be safe and start trying to be real." The network of light pulsed brighter, and Tom understood that he was being offered a choice more profound than career or relationship. He was being invited to step into his authentic self, to align his life with his deepest purpose, to become a bridge between the human world and the vast intelligence of the natural one. "If I do this," he said, "if I really commit to this path, there's no going back to the safe life." "No," Sarah agreed. "There's only going forward to the meaningful one." Tom took a deep breath, feeling the forest's rhythm synchronize with his own heartbeat. Around him, the trees swayed in anticipation, their bioluminescent network brightening as if responding to his approaching decision. "I choose growth," he said, his voice carrying across the network of light. "I choose wonder. I choose to become who I was meant to be." The moment the words left his mouth, reality crystallized around his choice. Tom opened his eyes to sunlight streaming through his truck's windshield. He was sitting in the driver's seat at the trailhead, keys still in the ignition, engine cold. According to his watch, it was 6:23 a.m., exactly 12 hours and 36 minutes since he'd first parked here yesterday. For a moment, disorientation overwhelmed him. Had the entire experience been an elaborate dream, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by months of grief and self-doubt? But when he looked down at his hands, he found them stained with ash from the dissolved journal, and his boots were caked with mud from paths that didn't exist on any map. More importantly, the overwhelming sense of clarity remained. The fog of confusion and purposelessness that had clouded his thoughts for months had lifted completely. Tom knew with absolute certainty what he needed to do. He pulled out his phone and was surprised to find full signal strength. Without hesitation, he dialed a number he'd avoided calling for 8 months. "Tom?" Sarah's voice carried across the connection, surprised but not unwelcoming. "Is everything okay?" "It's early. I quit my job yesterday," he said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. "I'm going back to school. Oregon State has a doctoral program in forest ecology that focuses on mycorrhizal networks, the underground communication systems between trees. I'm going to study how forests share information and resources. I'm going to help people understand that trees aren't just individual organisms competing for resources, but members of a community that takes care of each other." Silence stretched across the line. Tom held his breath, waiting for Sarah's response. "Tom, that's—" She paused, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "That's the most like yourself you've sounded in years. What changed?" "I remembered who I wanted to be when I grew up, and I realized it's not too late to become him. The program you're talking about, that's Dr. Elizabeth Morrison's research, isn't it? She's doing groundbreaking work on forest communication networks." Tom was surprised Sarah knew about Morrison's research, then remembered that she'd always paid attention to his interests, even when he'd stopped pursuing them himself. "You've been following the research?" "I never stopped believing you'd find your way back to it eventually. Even when you seemed determined to bury that part of yourself. Tom leaned back in his truck seat, watching early morning light filter through the forest canopy. The trees looked different now, not just as resources to be managed or scenery to be protected, but as members of an ancient, complex society he was only beginning to understand. Sarah, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but would you consider having coffee with me? Not to get back together, not to pick up where we left off, but to meet who I'm becoming. Another pause, shorter this time. I'd like that, Tom. I'd like that very much. After ending the call, Tom sat quietly in his truck, feeling the weight of his decision settle around him like a comfortable coat. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. Returning to school at 43 meant financial uncertainty, academic challenges, and the humbling experience of being a student again after decades of professional competence. But for the first time in years, difficulty felt like adventure rather than threat. He started the engine and began the drive back to town, already composing his resignation letter in his mind. His supervisor would be shocked. Tom Mitchell was the most reliable, predictable ranger in the district. But reliability built on fear was just another form of hiding. As he drove through the early morning forest, Tom noticed things he'd overlooked for years. The way sunlight revealed the misty breath of sleeping trees. The intricate patterns of moss that indicated underground water sources. The subtle signs of wildlife activity that spoke of healthy, interconnected ecosystems. He thought about the cabin, wondering if it still existed or if it had faded back into possibility now that its purpose was fulfilled. Perhaps other lost souls would find it when they needed to remember who they were meant to become. Perhaps it would appear to anyone brave enough to leave the marked trails and venture into unmarked territory. The forest held its secrets gently, Tom realized. It didn't hide truth. It simply waited for people ready to see beyond their assumptions and fears. By the time he reached the district office, Tom's resignation letter was fully formed in his mind. He would submit it today, apply to graduate school this afternoon, and begin the long, uncertain, beautiful work of becoming himself. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of fog and illuminating a future that finally felt worth pursuing. 3 weeks later, Tom sat in the admissions office at Oregon State University. His application materials spread across the desk like tarot cards predicting his future. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the Forest Ecology Department head, studied his transcripts with the intensity of someone reading ancient scripture. Your undergraduate work was exceptional, she said, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. But there's a 15-year gap in your academic record. That's unusual for doctoral candidates. Tom had prepared for this question, but the honest answer still felt risky. D'année to diunde. I took what I thought was the practical path. Steady employment, financial security. It took me longer than it should have to realize that safety without purpose isn't really safety at all. Dr. Morrison set down his transcripts and leaned back in her chair. She was younger than Tom had expected, perhaps early 40s, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of focused intensity that suggested a mind constantly processing complex information. Your research proposal is fascinating, she continued. The idea that mycorrhizal networks might function as forest-wide communication systems isn't new, but your approach to studying the biochemical languages involved. She paused, studying his face. Where did this specific focus come from? Tom thought about the glowing network he'd witnessed in the cabin, the moment when he'd touched the luminous thread connecting tree to tree and felt the flow of information at a cellular level. But that wasn't something he could explain to a scientist without sounding delusional. I've spent 15 years walking through forests professionally, he said instead. You start to notice patterns, relationships that traditional forest management doesn't account for. Trees that thrive in unexpected conditions, stands that recover from disturbance faster than they should, symbiotic relationships that seem almost intentional. Almost intentional, Dr. Morrison repeated. That's an interesting choice of words. I think we've been studying trees as individual organisms competing for resources when they might actually be collaborative members of a larger intelligence, like studying single neurons instead of recognizing they're part of a brain. Dr. Morrison's eyes brightened with the kind of excitement academics reserved for genuinely novel ideas. You're proposing that forests might exhibit emergent collective intelligence? I'm proposing we don't know enough about how they communicate to rule it out. She stood and walked to her office window, which overlooked a small grove of Douglas firs on the university campus. The funding for this kind of research is limited. The time frame for meaningful results could be years, and you'd be working with researchers half your age who've never done anything but academics. I understand. Do you? Because what you're describing isn't just a career change. It's a complete reconstruction of your identity. Most people your age are thinking about retirement planning, not starting over in one of the most demanding fields in science. Tom followed her gaze to the trees outside. Even through the window, he could sense the subtle connections between them. The underground conversations he was only beginning to understand. Dr. Morrison, I've spent the last 15 years maintaining forests, making sure they stayed exactly as they were, protecting them from change. But forests aren't static systems. They're dynamic, adaptive, constantly evolving. I want to study that evolution, not just preserve a snapshot of it. She turned back to him, and Tom saw something shift in her expression. There's a research station about 60 miles east of here. Old-growth forest that's been undisturbed for over 300 years. We've been monitoring basic ecological indicators there for a decade, but we've never had the resources to do the kind of intensive biochemical analysis your proposal suggests. What kind of analysis? Soil sampling, root network mapping, chemical signature tracking. The infrastructure is there, but it requires someone willing to spend months in relative isolation, collecting data that might lead nowhere. She smiled. It's exactly the kind of project that could make a career or destroy one. Tom felt the familiar flutter of fear in his stomach, the voice that had guided him towards safe choices for so long. But underneath it was something stronger, curiosity, purpose, the deep satisfaction of aligning his life with his authentic interests. When would I start? Dr. Morrison's smile widened. Assuming the admissions committee approves your application, you could begin preliminary fieldwork this summer. The real research would start in the fall, after you've completed your first semester of coursework. They spent the next hour discussing practicalities, housing, equipment, research protocols, the complex dance of academic bureaucracy that surrounded cutting-edge science. But Tom's mind kept returning to the forest research station, to the possibility of spending months in deep communion with an old-growth ecosystem that had never been logged, never been managed, never been forced to conform to human expectations. Tom's first day at the research station began before dawn. The small cabin that would serve as his base of operations sat in a clearing barely large enough to accommodate the solar panels and weather monitoring equipment. Around him, ancient Douglas firs rose like cathedral pillars, their canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight. Dr. Morrison had driven him out the previous evening, helping him unload supplies and equipment that would sustain him for the next 3 months. The isolation was more complete than anything Tom had experienced as a ranger. No radio chatter, no hiking trails, no distant sounds of human activity. Just the forest breathing around him in rhythms older than civilization. He began with basic observations, following protocols Dr. Morrison's team had established over years of preliminary research. Soil temperature readings every 6 hours, weather data collection, photographic documentation of seasonal changes in undergrowth and canopy density. The work was methodical, almost meditative, requiring the kind of patient attention Tom had once brought to his garden. Maintenance, but on his 3rd morning, something changed. Tom was collecting soil samples near a massive cedar tree when he noticed an unusual pattern in the forest floor. The moss grew in distinct lines, radiating outward from the base of the tree, creating pathways that seemed too regular to be random. Following one of these moss highways, he discovered it led directly to a cluster of younger trees about 30 yards away. He knelt and carefully excavated a small section of soil along the moss line. What he found made him forget to breathe. The roots weren't just interconnected, they were organized. Thick primary roots from the cedar connected to thinner secondary roots from the younger trees in a pattern that looked disturbingly purposeful. More intriguing still, the soil around these connections showed unusual coloration, patches of darker earth that seemed to pulse with moisture and nutrients. Tom photographed everything, then collected samples of the unusual soil for later analysis. But as he worked, he became aware of something that shouldn't have been possible. The forest was watching him, not individual animals or birds, though those were certainly present. The forest itself seemed aware of his activities, responding to his presence in subtle ways. When he moved to a new sampling location, insects would quiet for exactly 30 seconds before resuming their normal activity. When he paused to make notes, the quality of light filtering through the canopy would shift almost imperceptibly, as if the trees were adjusting their positions to observe him better. By the fourth day, Tom had abandoned any pretense of following standard research protocols. The forest was teaching him, showing him patterns and connections that no textbook had prepared him to recognize. He began mapping what he privately called conversation. Nodes, areas where multiple root systems converged in complex tangles that seemed to facilitate some kind of information exchange. The most remarkable discovery came during his second week. Tom was tracking a particularly intricate root network when he noticed that one of the connection points was warm to the touch. Not just warmer than the surrounding soil, but actively generating heat. When he placed his hand directly on the junction, he felt a subtle vibration, like a pulse or heartbeat. Curious, he pressed his ear to the ground above the warm spot. What he heard defied everything he thought he knew about forest ecosystems. The earth was humming, not the random sounds of insect activity or underground water movement, but a low, rhythmic tone that seemed to emanate from the root network itself. The frequency was just at the edge of human hearing, a bass note that resonated through his bones as much as his ears. Tom spent hours listening to different connection points throughout the forest, gradually mapping what could only be described as a communication system. The humming varied in pitch and rhythm depending on location, time of day, and weather conditions. During rainstorms, the frequency increased noticeably. During periods of bright sunlight, it shifted to a higher, more energetic tone. But the most startling discovery was that the network seemed to respond to his presence. When Tom approached a new listening location, the humming would change, becoming more complex, as if the forest was acknowledging his attention and adjusting its communication accordingly. On his 15th day at the station, Tom made the decision that would define the rest of his research. Instead of simply observing and documenting the forest's behavior, he decided to try communicating with it. He chose the largest conversation node he'd discovered, a complex junction where roots from 7 ancient trees converged in an intricate braid beneath a natural depression in the forest floor. Kneeling beside the warm earth, Tom placed both hands on the root network and began to hum back. The forest's response was immediate and overwhelming. The underground humming intensified, harmonizing with Tom's voice, creating resonances and overtones that filled the clearing with music that felt older than human language. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Tom felt connected to something vast and ancient and profoundly alive. When the harmonics finally faded, Tom sat in stunned silence, understanding that he had just participated in the first documented conversation between a human being and a forest ecosystem. His research had taken a turn that would challenge every assumption about the nature of plant intelligence and the possibility of interspecies communication. Tom's hands trembled as he documented his first successful communication attempt. How could he possibly explain to Dr. Morrison that the forest had sung back to him, that the underground network had recognized his attempt at contact and responded with what could only be described as enthusiasm? He spent the following days refining his approach, learning the subtle differences in tone and rhythm that seemed to elicit different responses from the root network. High, quick pulses near the surface roots triggered rapid exchanges between nearby trees. Deeper, slower tones seemed to activate connections that stretched across the entire research area. Most fascinating of all, certain combinations of frequencies would cause the network to go completely silent, as if the forest was listening with total attention. During his third week, Sarah called. "Tom, you sound different, more centered somehow." He was sitting outside the research cabin as sunset painted the forest in shades of gold and amber. Around him, the evening shift change was beginning, day creatures yielding the forest to their nocturnal counterparts in an ancient rhythm he was only beginning to appreciate. "I'm learning to listen in ways I never imagined possible," he said. Watching a family of deer move through the clearing with the unhurried confidence of creatures who belonged exactly where they were. "Tell me what you mean." Tom hesitated. Sarah was a nurse, trained in scientific skepticism and evidence-based thinking. How could he explain that he was having conversations with trees without sounding like someone who'd been alone in the woods too long? "The forest isn't just a collection of individual organisms," he said carefully. "It's a unified system with its own intelligence, its own methods of processing and sharing information. What we've been calling competition for resources is actually cooperation on a scale we're just beginning to understand." "That's fascinating, but it sounds like something you could study in any forest. What makes this location special?" Tom looked around the clearing, seeing not just trees and undergrowth, but the visible manifestation of an ancient network that had been developing connections for centuries without human interference. "This forest has never been logged, never been managed, never been forced to adapt to human intervention. It's had 300 years to develop communication networks that most ecosystems never get the chance to establish. It's like finding a library that's been collecting knowledge for generations, and you're learning to read the books. I'm learning that the books are reading me too." That evening, Tom made his most ambitious attempt yet at forest communication. Instead of approaching a single conversation node, he positioned himself at the center of the clearing and tried to connect with the entire network simultaneously. The response was overwhelming. Every tree in the immediate area seemed to activate at once, their underground connections creating a symphony of harmonics that made the earth itself vibrate. Tom felt the network's attention focus on him like a spotlight, and for a terrifying moment, he experienced the sensation of being completely known. Every memory, every fear, every hope examined with alien intelligence. But instead of feeling invaded, Tom felt welcomed. The network wasn't judging his thoughts and emotions. It was incorporating them into its vast store of information about the world. He was being catalogued not as an intruder, but as a new voice in an ancient conversation. Images flooded his mind, not visual exactly, but impressions that translated into understanding. He saw the forest as it had been decades ago, centuries ago, experienced through the slow perception of trees that measured time in seasons rather than moments. He felt the network's memory of storms weathered, droughts endured, the slow dance of growth and decay that maintained the ecosystem's balance. Most remarkably, he sensed the network learning from him. His human perspective on time, his memories of technological change, his understanding of the broader world beyond the forest, all of it was being absorbed and integrated into the collective intelligence that surrounded him. When the connection finally faded, Tom found himself lying on the forest floor, exhausted but exhilarated. He had just participated in the first documented case of direct knowledge exchange between human consciousness and a forest ecosystem. The implications were staggering. But as he stumbled back to his cabin that night, Tom realized he faced a problem that could destroy his credibility before his research even began. How could he report his findings to Dr. Morrison and the academic community without sounding like he'd suffered a psychological breakdown? How could he convince rational scientists that trees were not only capable of complex communication, but were actively seeking to establish relationships with humans? The forest had trusted him with its secrets. Now he had to figure out how to share those secrets with a world that wasn't ready to believe them. His phone showed 7 missed calls from Dr. Morrison. In his excitement over the evening's breakthrough, he'd forgotten to check in as scheduled. The outside world was intruding on his forest sanctuary, demanding explanations he wasn't sure he could provide. Dr. Morrison arrived at the research station the next morning, her expression a mixture of concern and professional curiosity. Tom had spent most of the night preparing for this conversation, trying to find ways to present his discoveries that wouldn't immediately trigger academic skepticism. "Tom, you've missed 3 scheduled check-ins," she said, climbing out of her university vehicle. "Your last data transmission was 2 weeks ago. I was starting to worry you'd had an accident. I've been making discoveries that don't fit standard reporting protocols," Tom replied, leading her toward the clearing where his most significant observations had occurred. "What kind of discoveries?" Tom gestured toward the massive cedar tree where he'd first noticed the organized root patterns. "The mycorrhizal networks here aren't just sharing nutrients. They're processing and transmitting complex information. The trees are communicating in ways that suggest genuine intelligence." Dr. Morrison knelt beside the exposed root junction Tom had been studying, examining the unusual soil coloration and the intricate branching patterns. "This is remarkable structural organization," she admitted. "But intelligence is a strong word, Tom. We need to be careful about anthropomorphizing natural processes. What if they're not natural processes as we understand them? What if they're intentional behaviors?" Tom led her to several other conversation nodes throughout the forest, showing her the warm spots, the organized moss patterns, the geometric precision of root network intersections. Dr. Morrison documented everything with scientific thoroughness, but Tom could see her struggle to maintain objectivity as the evidence mounted. "The patterns are undeniably complex," she said finally. "But pattern doesn't necessarily imply consciousness. Crystalline structures show remarkable organization without intelligence. Crystals don't respond to external stimuli the way this network does. Watch this." Tom knelt beside the largest conversation node and began the humming technique he'd developed. Within seconds, the underground network responded with its harmonic resonance. The soil itself vibrating with rhythmic pulses that matched and complemented Tom's vocalizations. Dr. Morrison's scientific composure cracked. "That's impossible. Trees don't have the neurological structures necessary for that kind of coordinated response. Maybe they don't need neurological structures as we understand them. Maybe they've developed different methods of processing information," Tom continued humming. "And the network's response grew more complex, creating harmonies and counter-rhythms that demonstrated clear pattern recognition and adaptive behavior." Dr. Morrison placed her hands on the warm soil, feeling the vibrations for herself. "This changes everything we thought we knew about plant intelligence," she whispered, but as Tom prepared to share his most remarkable discovery, the direct consciousness exchange he'd experienced the previous evening, Dr. Morrison's phone rang. She answered with obvious reluctance. Dr. Morrison speaking. "Yes, I'm at the research station now. When did this happen?" Tom watched her face change as she listened to the caller, professional excitement giving way to something that looked like dread. "I understand. Yes, we'll return immediately." She ended the call and turned to Tom with an expression he couldn't read. "We need to leave now. What's wrong?" "The university has received calls from environmental groups, logging companies, and 3 different government agencies asking about our research here. Someone leaked information about what you've been discovering." Tom felt his stomach drop. "How is that possible?" "I haven't shared my findings with anyone. Your phone calls with Sarah have been monitored. Your data transmissions were intercepted, and there are satellite images showing unusual thermal signatures in this forest that correspond exactly to your conversation nodes. The implications hit Tom like a physical blow. They know about the network. They know something unusual is happening here, and every interest group in the Pacific Northwest wants to control it. Dr. Morrison began gathering her equipment with urgent efficiency. Environmental groups see potential evidence of forest consciousness that could revolutionize conservation law. Logging companies want to suppress any research that might interfere with timber rights. Government agencies are interested in anything that might represent a new form of intelligence. What about the trees? What about protecting the network? That's what we're going to try to do. But first, we need to get you and your research data somewhere safe. Tom looked around the clearing that had become his second home, the forest that had trusted him with its secrets. I can't leave them. They're just starting to accept me as part of their community. If you stay, you'll lose any chance of protecting them legally. Your research is the only evidence we have that this network represents something worth preserving, but only if we can present it through proper academic channels before outside interests. Destroy the site. A new sound echoed through the forest, the distant rumble of heavy machinery. Dr. Morrison's face went pale. They're already here. Tom, we need to go now. Tom grabbed his research journals and data drives, while Dr. Morrison loaded the most critical equipment into her vehicle. The sound of machinery grew closer, accompanied by the harsh voices of men who spoke in the clipped tones of corporate efficiency. There's a back trail, Tom said, throwing his pack into the passenger seat. It leads to an old logging road that connects to the highway about 5 miles north. But as they prepared to leave, something unprecedented happened. The forest itself began to respond to the approaching threat. Every conversation node Tom had mapped suddenly activated simultaneously. The underground humming he'd grown accustomed to amplified into a deep thrumming that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. Trees throughout the research area began releasing chemical signals, not the slow, subtle communications Tom had observed before, but urgent alarm calls that filled the air with the sharp scent of distress. The network knows, Tom breathed. It's responding to the invasion. Dr. Morrison stared in amazement as visible changes swept through the forest. Moss began growing at accelerated rates, covering equipment and blocking access paths. Vines descended from the canopy, creating barriers where none had existed moments before. Most remarkably, the root systems began shifting underground, creating soft spots and sudden depressions that would make heavy machinery impossible to maneuver. It's defending itself, she whispered. The first corporate vehicles appeared at the forest edge. Black SUVs followed by a truck carrying surveying equipment. Men in expensive suits emerged, accompanied by workers in hard hats who began unloading chainsaws and marking paint. Tom felt the network's distress as a physical pain in his chest. The forest that had welcomed him, taught him, shared its ancient wisdom with him, was now under direct assault. Every instinct screamed at him to stay and fight, to position himself between the trees and the chainsaws. Tom, we have to go, Dr. Morrison urged. Staying won't help them. But as they reached the back trail, Tom realized the forest had one more lesson to teach him. The path he'd used dozens of times over the past month had changed. Where there had been clear access through the undergrowth, new growth had appeared overnight, creating a maze of natural barriers that would confuse anyone unfamiliar with the forest's layout. The trees were protecting their escape route. Following instincts he couldn't explain, Tom navigated the altered trail system, trusting the subtle cues the network provided. A shaft of sunlight here, a barely perceptible warm spot there. The whisper of wind through branches that seemed to point in specific directions. Dr. Morrison followed without question, her scientific mind already processing the implications of what she was witnessing. They reached the old logging road just as the first chainsaw roared to life behind them. The sound cut through the forest like a scream. and Tom felt the network's pain resonate through every fiber of his being. "We have to document this," he said, pulling out his camera as they drove toward the highway. The forest's defensive responses, the accelerated growth, the coordinated protection strategies. This isn't just intelligence, it's tactical thinking. Tom, what we witnessed back there will revolutionize our understanding of plant cognition and ecosystem dynamics. But only if we can present it properly, through peer review and scientific verification. And how long will that take? Months? Years? By then, they'll have clear-cut the entire research area. Dr. Morrison was quiet for a moment, wrestling with the tension between scientific methodology and immediate necessity. There might be another way. Environmental law includes provisions for protecting areas that demonstrate unique biological significance. If we can get emergency injunctions based on your preliminary findings, would that hold up in court? Not forever. But it might buy us enough time to conduct proper documentation and build a legal case. Tom looked back toward the forest, now hidden behind hills and distance, but still painfully present in his thoughts. Somewhere in those ancient trees, a network of intelligence older than human civilization was fighting for its survival. His role had suddenly shifted from researcher to advocate, from observer to protector. "There's something else," he said quietly. "The network didn't just show me how trees communicate. It showed me how they remember. That forest contains 3 centuries of accumulated knowledge about weather patterns, ecosystem changes, climate adaptation strategies. If we lose it, we're not just destroying trees, we're erasing a library of environmental data that could be crucial for understanding climate change." Dr. Morrison's expression hardened with resolve. "Then we don't let them destroy it. We use everything you've discovered to build a case that even corporate lawyers can't dismiss." But as they reached the highway, Tom wondered if they were already too late. The sound of chainsaws had followed them for miles. A mechanical heartbeat, counting down the final moments of something irreplaceable. The emergency injunction hearing took place in a Portland courthouse 3 days later. Tom sat at the plaintiff's table beside Dr. Morrison and their hastily assembled legal team, watching corporate lawyers in $1,000 suits arrange their counterarguments with practiced efficiency. Judge Patricia Hendricks, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes, reviewed the preliminary evidence with obvious skepticism. Tom's photographs, audio recordings, and soil samples were spread across the evidence table like relics from a lost civilization. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Hendricks said, "you're asking this court to halt a legally permitted development project based on your claim that trees are capable of conscious communication. Do you understand how extraordinary that assertion is?" Tom stood slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility for everything he'd discovered. "Your Honor, I understand it sounds impossible. 6 months ago I would have been skeptical too. But the evidence is clear. The forest in question demonstrates organized intelligence, memory storage, and adaptive problem-solving capabilities that exceed anything previously documented in plant science." The lead corporate attorney, a sharp-faced man named Davidson, rose with an expression of barely contained disdain. "Your Honor, the plaintiff is asking you to accept the testimony of a single researcher who admits he's been working in isolation for weeks. His claims have not been peer-reviewed, verified by independent observation, or subjected to any scientific scrutiny whatsoever." "The research is ongoing," Dr. Morrison interjected. "Mr. Mitchell's preliminary findings justify immediate protection while we conduct proper verification studies." "Preliminary findings," Davidson repeated, "based on what the plaintiff describes as conversations with trees." "Your Honor, this is either elaborate fraud or the delusions of someone who's spent too much time alone in the wilderness." Judge Hendricks studied Tom's face with uncomfortable intensity. "Mr. Mitchell, can you demonstrate these alleged communications in this courtroom?" Tom felt his heart sink. The network required direct contact with the forest ecosystem, connection to the root networks, and conversation nodes he'd spent weeks learning to access. "No, Your Honor. The communication requires physical contact with the established mycorrhizal networks. How convenient, Davidson muttered. But Tom wasn't finished. However, I can present evidence of the network's defensive responses to the current threat. Evidence that was recorded yesterday. He nodded to Dr. Morrison, who activated a laptop connected to the courtroom's projection system. The screen filled with time-lapse footage, taken from hidden cameras they'd positioned around the research site after receiving the injunction. Request. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the forest transformed itself in fast-forward. Trees that had stood in static positions for decades visibly shifted their root systems, creating barriers and soft spots that made heavy equipment access impossible. Moss growth that should have taken months occurred in hours. Most dramatically, the network's thermal signatures created visible heat patterns that spelled out geometric shapes across the forest floor. The trees are literally rearranging themselves to prevent access, Tom explained. This isn't random growth or natural variation. This is coordinated defensive action. Judge Hendricks leaned forward, studying the footage with obvious fascination. Dr. Morrison, have you seen anything like this before? Never, Your Honor. Plant behavior this coordinated and purposeful has no precedent in scientific literature. If we destroy this forest before studying it properly, we'll lose what might be the only documented case of genuine plant intelligence in existence. Davidson stood again, his confidence slightly shaken. Your Honor, unusual growth patterns don't constitute intelligence. The defendants have substantial financial investments in this project, employees depending on the work, and legal permits that were issued after proper environmental review. An environmental review that failed to identify the unique properties of this ecosystem, Dr. Morrison countered. Properties that could revolutionize our understanding of forest management and climate adaptation. Tom watched Judge Hendricks wrestle with the decision, her expression cycling between skepticism and wonder as she reviewed the evidence again. Outside the courthouse, he knew both environmental protesters and corporate interests were waiting for her ruling. Mr. Mitchell, the judge said finally, assuming I grant a temporary injunction, how long would you need to complete your research? 6 months minimum for basic documentation, a year for comprehensive analysis. And if your research proves inconclusive, if you can't verify these intelligence claims through standard scientific methods. Tom thought about the forest's trust, the ancient network that had accepted him as part of its community. Then I'll personally recommend that development proceed, Your Honor. But if I'm right, if this forest represents a breakthrough in our understanding of plant consciousness, then preserving it could be the most important scientific decision of the century. Judge Hendricks was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving between the evidence, the lawyers, and Tom's face. I'm granting a 6-month temporary injunction, she announced. Mr. Mitchell, you have until spring to prove your extraordinary claims with extraordinary evidence. Tom returned to the forest 2 weeks later with a team of independent researchers, each specializing in different aspects of plant biology and ecosystem dynamics. Dr. Sarah Chen, a biochemist from UC Berkeley, Dr. James Wright, a soil ecologist from Colorado State, Dr. Maria Santos, a neurobiologist studying plant cognition at Stanford, and Dr. Morrison coordinating the multidisciplinary approach that would either validate Tom's discoveries or expose them as elaborate self-deception. The forest welcomed them back with an intensity that surprised even Tom. The moment they entered the research area, every conversation node activated simultaneously, creating a harmonic resonance that made the equipment readings spike beyond normal parameters. The thermal signatures are off the charts, Dr. Chen reported, studying her spectrometer readings. The biochemical activity in these root junctions is unlike anything I've documented. Dr. Wright knelt beside one of the warm spots Tom had mapped, carefully excavating soil samples that revealed the intricate root braiding beneath. This level of organization doesn't occur naturally. These connections show clear evidence of intentional construction. But it was Dr. Santos who made the breakthrough, that would change everything. "Tom, show me the communication technique you developed," she said. Positioning sensitive audio equipment around the largest conversation node, Tom knelt beside the network junction and began the humming pattern he'd refined over weeks of practice. The forest's response was immediate and enthusiastic, underground harmonics joining his vocalizations in complex musical patterns. Dr. Santos watched her equipment readings with growing excitement. "The frequency modulations match patterns we see in dolphin communication, but more complex." "Much more complex? What do you mean?" Dr. Morrison asked. "I mean, the forest isn't just responding to Tom's sounds. It's generating new harmonic combinations, testing variations, building on the musical themes he introduces. This is conversational exchange, not simple stimulus response." Over the following days, the team documented phenomenon after phenomenon that challenged every assumption about plant intelligence. The network demonstrated memory by repeating musical patterns from previous sessions. It showed learning by incorporating new harmonic elements the researchers introduced. Most remarkably, it began generating entirely original compositions that conveyed distinct emotional content: joy when the team arrived each morning, melancholy when they prepared to leave each evening. "We're not just observing plant intelligence," Dr. Santos concluded after a week of intensive study. "We're documenting the existence of a forest-wide consciousness that has been developing for centuries, but their success created new problems. Word of the research leaked, despite their attempts at secrecy, attracting attention from groups with agendas that had nothing to do with scientific discovery." The first protesters arrived on a foggy Tuesday morning. Environmental activists who saw the conscious forest as proof that all logging should be banned immediately. Corporate representatives who viewed the research as a threat to the entire timber industry. Government officials who worried about the legal implications of establishing plant consciousness. "This is getting out of hand," Dr. Morrison said, watching news vans assemble at the forest perimeter. "We're losing control of the narrative before we finish the research," Tom stood in the center of the clearing, feeling the network's confusion and distress as human conflict erupted around its home. The trees had welcomed the research team as friends, but the arrival of so many people with hostile intentions was triggering defensive responses that made scientific observation increasingly difficult. "They're frightened," he said quietly. "The network doesn't understand why humans are gathering here with such aggressive energy." That evening, as the team prepared their daily reports, Tom made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of documenting the forest's responses in scientific language, he began translating them as direct communication. "What are you doing?" Dr. Chen asked, watching him type. "I'm letting them speak for themselves," Tom replied. "Instead of describing what we observe, I'm recording what they're trying to tell us." The resulting transcript was unlike any scientific document ever produced. "We have watched your species for many generations. We have seen you build and destroy, create and abandon. We have tried to teach you about cooperation, about the patience required for sustainable growth, about the wisdom that comes from listening to the earth itself. But you move too quickly, think too briefly, fight too often. We offer ourselves as teachers if you are ready to learn." Dr. Morrison read over Tom's shoulder, her expression shifting from concern to wonder. "Tom, if this is genuine communication, if we can establish verifiable dialogue between humans and forest consciousness, then everything changes," Tom finished. "Law, ethics, environmental policy, our entire relationship with the natural world." Outside, the protest camps were growing larger, their conflicting voices creating a cacophony that seemed to make the trees themselves recoil. Tom realized they were running out of time to establish meaningful communication before outside pressures destroyed any possibility of peaceful contact. The confrontation came at dawn on Tom's 93rd day in the forest. He woke to the sound of chainsaws revving just beyond the research perimeter. followed by shouting voices and the mechanical rumble of heavy equipment. Corporate security forces had arrived during the night, claiming the temporary injunction had expired due to a legal technicality. Environmental protesters formed human chains around the ancient trees, while corporate lawyers argued with federal marshals about jurisdiction and property rights. Tom rushed to the largest conversation node, desperate to understand how the network was processing this chaos. What he found there changed everything. The forest was no longer just defending itself, it was actively communicating with the outside world. Every news crew, every protester, every corporate representative who had spent time near the trees was experiencing the same phenomenon Tom had discovered months earlier. The network was reaching out, establishing contact, attempting to bridge the gap between human and forest consciousness. Dr. Santos found him there 20 minutes later, her equipment registering electromagnetic anomalies that defied explanation. Tom, something unprecedented is happening. The network isn't just local anymore. It's connecting to other forest systems across the entire Pacific Northwest. We're seeing synchronized responses from old-growth stands in 3 different states. It's calling for help, Tom realized. The network is activating every connected forest, creating a continental communication system. Across the protest camps, people began reporting identical experiences. Vivid dreams of root systems and underground conversations, sudden understanding of plant communication, an overwhelming sense of ancient wisdom trying to share itself with human consciousness. The corporate executives who had arrived to oversee the logging operation found themselves unable to give orders to cut down trees they now perceived as sentient beings. Environmental protesters discovered that their anger was being transformed into something deeper, a profound sense of responsibility for protecting something far more precious than they had imagined. Sarah arrived that morning, having driven through the night after seeing news coverage of the forest controversy. Tom met her at the edge of the clearing, where the boundary between human conflict and forest peace remained starkly visible. "The entire country is watching this place," she said, gesturing toward the satellite trucks and news helicopters circling overhead. "Scientists, philosophers, religious leaders, everyone wants to understand what's happening here. The forest is trying to teach us," Tom replied. "But we're so busy arguing about ownership and rights that we're missing the lesson." Together, they walked to the center of the clearing, where Tom had first learned to communicate with the network. Sarah placed her hands on the warm soil beside his and immediately gasped as the connection formed. For the first time, she experienced what Tom had been trying to describe for months: the patient consciousness of trees measuring time in centuries. The collaborative intelligence of an ecosystem that had learned to thrive through cooperation rather than competition. The profound loneliness of a forest trying to share its wisdom with a species too busy fighting itself to listen. "They're not trying to stop human progress," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They're trying to show us how to progress without destroying everything in the process." Around them, the chaos of human conflict began to shift. One by one, protesters and corporate representatives approached the conversation nodes, drawn by curiosity or desperation to understand what was causing such profound changes in everyone who touched the network. Tom watched a logging foreman kneel beside an ancient cedar, his hands pressed against its bark as 40 years of viewing trees as commodity transformed into recognition of individual personality and ancient wisdom. An environmental lawyer found herself in wordless communication with a stand of Douglas firs, understanding for the first time that preservation meant partnership, not just protection. But the most remarkable transformation occurred when Judge Hendricks arrived. Having driven from Portland after receiving reports that her temporary injunction had triggered a phenomenon beyond legal precedent. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, approaching the central clearing where Tom maintained his vigil beside the network. "I need to understand what's happening here. The entire legal framework for environmental protection is being challenged by claims of plant consciousness. Tom gestured toward the conversation node. Your Honor, the only way to understand is to experience it directly. Judge Hendricks hesitated for a moment, then knelt beside the network junction. Tom guided her through the basic communication technique, and within minutes, her face transformed with the same wonder and recognition that had affected everyone who made genuine contact with the forest consciousness. When she finally lifted her hands from the warm soil, Judge Hendricks looked around the clearing with completely different eyes. This changes everything, she said quietly. Not just environmental law, but our entire understanding of what constitutes personhood, consciousness and rights under the law. 1 year later, Tom stood in the same clearing where his transformation had begun, but everything around him had changed. The research station had expanded into a permanent facility, welcoming scientists from around the world to study what was now officially recognized as the first documented case of forest consciousness. The legal precedent established by Judge Hendricks's landmark ruling had revolutionized environmental law. Forests demonstrating complex communication networks were now granted protection status similar to endangered species, but with additional rights that acknowledged their capacity for intelligent interaction with human society. Sarah walked beside him along paths that had been formalized into educational trails, where visitors could learn the basic techniques of forest communication. Their relationship had evolved too, rebuilt on the foundation of who Tom had become rather than who he had been afraid to be. The delegation from the European Union arrives tomorrow, she said, checking the tablet that helped her coordinate the international research program she now managed. They want to establish similar communication protocols with old-growth forests in Germany and Scandinavia. Tom nodded, watching a group of graduate students practice the harmonic techniques that had once seemed impossible. The forest responded to their efforts with patient encouragement, adjusting its communication patterns to accommodate human learning styles, just as it had once adapted to Tom's fumbling first attempts. Dr. Morrison emerged from the expanded research facility, carrying data that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. The network connections are still expanding, she reported. We're documenting communication links between forest systems across 4 continents now. It's as if establishing contact with this one network opened channels to a global forest consciousness. What are they telling us? Tom asked. That's the remarkable part. Each forest system has its own personality, its own areas of expertise. The Amazon networks specialize in rapid growth and adaptation strategies. The boreal forests of Canada focus on long-term climate resilience. The temperate rainforests share information about water management and sustainable resource cycling. Tom smiled, remembering his early assumption that he was studying a single forest ecosystem. The reality had proven far more complex and wonderful than his wildest scientific fantasies. A familiar humming rose from the conversation nodes around the clearing, not the distress signals that had marked the early days of conflict, but the harmonious greeting the forest offered to welcome each new day. Tom joined his voice to the network song, a daily ritual that had become as natural as breathing. The response was immediate and joyful. After a year of constant interaction, the forest recognized Tom not just as a researcher or protector, but as a permanent member of its extended community. The connection carried information about weather patterns, the health of various tree populations, and something that felt remarkably like affection. They're sharing something new today, Tom said, interpreting the complex harmonics flowing through the network. Information about human integration techniques. They want to teach us how to design our communities to work in partnership with forest systems rather than in opposition to them. Sarah looked up from her tablet, intrigued. Urban planning applications? More than that. They're offering to help us redesign human civilization to function like a forest ecosystem, sustainable, collaborative, focused on long-term health rather than short-term resource extraction. A new group of visitors approached the clearing, children from a local elementary school, their faces bright with curiosity and completely free of the skepticism that had initially greeted Tom's discoveries. They settled around the conversation nodes with the easy acceptance of minds not yet trained to doubt the impossible. Tom watched the youngest children, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, establish communication with the network faster than many adult researchers. Their lack of preconceptions about what trees could or couldn't do allowed them to accept forest consciousness as naturally as they accepted any other new friendship. "This is how it starts," Sarah said quietly, observing the same phenomenon. "The next generation won't see forest communication as extraordinary. They'll grow up expecting to collaborate with natural systems." As evening approached, Tom made his way to the memorial grove that had been established near the original cabin site. Though the mysterious cabin had never reappeared after that first transformative night, the trees in this area maintained a special quality that reminded him daily of the choice that had changed his life. He pressed his hand against the bark of the ancient oak that had witnessed his first real conversation with forest consciousness, feeling the deep contentment that came from aligning his life's work with his authentic purpose. "Thank you," he whispered, knowing the network would understand that his gratitude extended far beyond the trees themselves to the mysterious forces that had guided him away from the safe path and toward the meaningful one. The forest hummed its gentle reply, a sound that carried across the clearing and beyond, connecting to the vast network of consciousness that spanned continents and bridged the ancient gap between human and natural intelligence. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new challenges, new opportunities to deepen the partnership between human and forest wisdom. But tonight, Tom simply stood in communion with the network that had taught him the most important lesson of all, that growth requires courage, that wonder requires vulnerability, and that the most profound transformations happen when we finally stop trying to be safe and start trying to be real.